Okay, so we are continuing our going through the Bible class, and as I promised last week, I took what I had up on all the board, and I only got as far as the Torah and the former prophets, which is fine because we're going to stay right in the former prophets section tonight anyway. Believe it or not, that takes me longer to put together than I would have liked, these sheets. But I'm enjoying having them, okay? I feel like I've come right out of the 90s, you know, those templates like in the 90s with like these weird colors and such. But come on in. So we're going through the overview of the Bible, and one of the things that we've been trying to look at, especially, that would really help the people online if I have my mic on, is trying to find some major themes, but looking at how the Bible was developed, designed as a whole, why each book is placed where it is. And one of the things that will help us to do is, one, it'll help us to better understand when we're reading individual books, like what is this book about? Right? If you know why it's there and what it's there for, it will help you to better understand when you're reading what to look for. Because I will be honest, there are things in books that as us on this side, especially some of the Old Testament stuff, there are some things it's okay, I don't grasp this, but it's okay. What you want to do is keep reading and see where is this story leading you, right? You may not understand all the nuances of, well, what does this time mean? What does this year mean? What is this king? Who's this king? Right? Because as you're reading, there's going to be a lot of names, a lot of places, and you can spend a lot of time getting out an atlas, trying to figure out where they are, right? Looking up maps, and those things can be helpful depending on the kind of study you're looking to do. But what I have found is people don't know their Bibles very well. They know their Bible stories well, and they may be able to go in and say, hey, tell me the story of David and Bathsheba. Okay, well, what happened before David and Bathsheba? What happened after David and Bathsheba? Why is David and Bathsheba in the location that it's at in 2 Samuel? Is it just, sometimes I think we imagine the Bible like this. Events are happening, and somebody's falling around. Oh, and then David... Oh, what did he do? Okay, a spear was thrown, and we kind of think of this like, narration that's just kind of happening, someone following someone around. It's not how it happened. These things are being written down many years later. So, here's the question. If they took the time many years later to write down a detail, do you think that detail is probably important? Do you think the placement of why they structured the story a certain way? Now, here's what we run into. Here's what people start questioning when you start talking about this stuff. So are you saying that the Bible's history is not real? Right? Have you ever retold a story? Is your retelling of the story ever the same way twice? All right, now put some distance between you and that story. And you're just trying to tell someone the main points of a story. Have you ever reordered a story when you're retelling it just to make it flow a little better? Something happened during your day, but you want to get these things out first and then these things, just to try to kind of have a comprehensive of, hey, here's what happened. Here's the significant things that happened. The Bible has a lot of that. These retellings, now obviously inspired by God, right? The authors and the people who are transcribing this believe they were inspired by doing it, but God definitely uses human authors in the way they saw things. Why do you think we have 4 different Gospels? Not only are there 4 different audiences, but it's literally 4 different perspectives of the same stories. And so if we go in trying to figure out, well, what are the details? Is it the 6th hour or the 9th hour? Right? Was it morning or was it afternoon? Someone's retelling of it, or if they're using a different time frame, or if they're using a different calendar, may be different, or if they're talking to a Roman or talking to a Greek, may be different. So we got to start thinking about our Bibles differently than just things were happening and, people closed their eyes and God just, transcribed every detail? Why is that detail being recorded? It's been passed down in history, a lot of it orally, through mouth, through tradition. That's why a lot of them, like Hebrews, when we talk about Hebrew parallelism and Hebrew poetry, why a lot of these stories are written to poetry, or because it's a memory tool. They use mnemonic devices. Like the Psalms are filled with, every third line starts with the same consonant, right? Every other line has a rhythm to it. We lose it in English because they don't end up the same way, right? Psalm 119 is a famous one, but it's not the only thing, right? Every section, it's the entire Hebrew alphabet. There's 12 verses. They all start with Aleph, which is the A, the first, then Bet, right? But it goes through, and that's how they remembered that long of a thing. So, we're trying to figure out, we're trying to better understand our Bibles, understanding who they are, or what's going on, who wrote it, why they wrote it, and I just gave you guys some charts in front of you. Does anyone not have one of these? I tried to lay them out. We went through the Torah, okay? And I just want to briefly summarize some of the things that we talked about because it's going to help us lead us right into Joshua. One of the things that you're learning in the very first book of the Bible is what? Beginnings. Where do we come from? Where did our story begin? Where did, this idea of sin, because when you read throughout the rest of the Old Testament, you're going to hear this word sin come up a lot. Well, if you don't know what in the world sin is, right, you might be able to piece it together, but the beginning story really helps you to define what is the true nature of sin. Because when you go back to the story of Adam and Eve, and Satan has tempted Eve, one of the things that Satan tells Eve is that you will be like God. So, interestingly thing enough, one of the reasons why knowledge and changing the law of God and not following the law of God is such a big deal. It's not just that God has put laws in place and you broke it. There's that, but it more has to do with you want to be in the place of God. And that's the story of mankind. You want to become God yourself, because the moment you say, God, I know you said this, but I'm going to go my way, who has become the God of your life? And so these stories take on, and they're always referenced back to, especially the first 5 books of the Bible. The rest of the Bible is always going, hey, remember what happened in exile? Remember what happened in the garden? Remember what happened with Moses? Remember, right? They're always looking back. They become archetypes and stories, foundations for us to follow and for us to live and understand our relationship between God. So Genesis, we kind of get all the beginnings. The covenant is established. Exodus, God decides, okay, the world has fallen. People have fallen. I'm going to select a certain family, right? And I'm going to call them out. And Exodus is the beginning of seeing that process begin, because God made a covenant with Abraham that I will make your descendants more numerous than the stars. And Exodus begins with a Pharaoh looking out on the Hebrews going, wow, look how big this nation has become. Pretty soon, if we let this continue to happen, they're going to overtake us. They will be in charge. And you're watching God's promise being fulfilled. Why are they being blessed this way when other nations and families are not? Well, God said, I will make your descendants. Okay? And so he draws them out because he also made a promise to Abraham about giving them some land, right? I'm going to go give you the promised land flowing with milk and honey. So he brings them out. Now, do they come willingly? Do they leave willingly? No. God displays his power, right, over Egypt, over foreign gods, and he's showing his presence, and that's really what they follow. In the book of Exodus, if God moves, what does Israel do? They move. If God stops, what do they stop? What do they do? They stop. How long? As long as God stays in a place, they stay there. As long as God, that's a lot of their grumbling and complaining. You know what it comes from? They're in a place too long, and they start getting restless, right? Moses on the Moses up getting the 10 Commandments, when they're in the Promised Land camping, they're kind of going, Egypt had better things to do than this. Egypt had better food, and they're relying on manna because they can't sustain themselves sitting in this one place as long as... And then when they start moving, this is tiring. We had homes back in Egypt, right? So no matter what God was doing, they were grumbling and complaining about it, which no wonder when they actually go into the Promised Land and they see the giants and they see Jericho, what do? We can't take that because they're so concerned about themselves. Leviticus is, okay, they build the tabernacle. Right at the end of Exodus, God goes to dwell in the tent of meeting, and what can Moses not do? So interestingly enough, and we're going to look at this if you're in my Leviticus class, we're starting Sunday night, Exodus ends with Moses not being able to enter in the tent of meeting. Numbers, guess what's the very first thing that happens in the book of Numbers? Moses goes in the tent of meeting and he talks with God. What happened in between Exodus and Numbers? The book of Leviticus. What is the book of Leviticus all about? How can we, unholy, unrighteous people, live with a holy God? It's all about the purification rituals, how we can be prepared to go into the tent of meeting, into the tabernacle, priests, how they have to purify, all these weird, strange laws that we think are really weird and strange. To them, they weren't. They just, hey, God said to do it. And they were doing it. Okay? And all of a sudden, Moses is now allowed to walk into the tent of meeting. So there's purification. The book of Numbers, yes, it does have some numbering of the people. And by the way, the number since when they left Egypt to now when they're going through the wilderness has already increased by like 5-fold again. So God's promise is continuing to ramp up. That's the whole point of the numbering. But most of the book is them in the wilderness, them being tested in the wilderness. And what do they do over and over and over again? They fail. God is trying to teach them, was trying to teach them, that if I'm with you, you shall not fear. Well, they feared, they failed the test, sending of the spies, all that kind of stuff. Deuteronomy, we call the second law, he foreshadowed exile, and it's the covenant of life and death. There should be a space in between of and life there. But Deuteronomy is to the second generation. He retells the law, and he basically ends it with this. God made a promise of his presence, and guess what he's going to require of you? For this covenant to work, guess what he requires of you? It's not perfect law keeping, right? It's not perfect even purification, because they literally, the moment they cleanse themselves from a sin, the book of Leviticus tells us that when they walk out, they're no longer what? They're no longer pure again anyway. So it's really a representation. That's why Hebrews says these were all types and shadows. They weren't literal things. You couldn't literally cleanse yourself with goat's blood. Hebrews tells us that. But there was a representation. Heart. I want all of your heart. If you obey me from the heart, if you obey all my laws from the heart, you will see that phrase over and over and over and over again. And it ends with, you will not give me your heart, therefore I'm going to send you into exile, and when I bring you back from exile, it will be because I have circumcised and given you a new heart. And that becomes an archetype for every little, even miniature exile, all the way to the time of Jesus, when Jesus says, I am going to give you a new heart. He's going back all the way back to Deuteronomy, a promise that God made Israel, that he's now offering for all who would just give their heart to whom? And their faith to whom? To Jesus, okay? The one who's the keeper of our covenant. He becomes the mediator of a new covenant, we call it. So he's able to go on to God on our behalf. So you're seeing the gospel develop, and the New Testament uses it this way, by the way. The New Testament, all the things we're talking about, the New Testament picks up on all these themes that they already knew, and they act as if, like when Jesus says, have you not read? He's not asking, have you read this verse? He's asking, you guys know, when he references a verse, what do I tell you to do? If there's an Old Testament reference, what do you go do? you go read that reference, but you read it in context, because he's normally using a phrase or a verse to get you to remind you of an entire thing that's happened. Right? When Matthew uses the virgin birth, he's wanting you to go back and to read all of Isaiah chapter 7. Okay? And what you find out is that this wasn't a one-to-one. There was a person there who was born of a virgin. Now, she was a virgin when he made the comment, but she wasn't a virgin when she gave birth, like with Mary. He fulfilled that, right? It's greater. But the fact of the matter is that there was this enemy that was coming against Israel, and the prophet asked, or the king asked, hey, when will God rescue us? And at that time, they were completely almost in exile. They called it in utter darkness. The enemy has won. When will you rescue us? When the Emmanuel comes. And so this kid, when he hit the age of 12 or 13, when he came, is when you know God is beginning to rescue you. And it's interesting that Luke, he brings up his birth, and then all of a sudden there's this random story of Jesus when he's 12 or 13 years old. And what is he doing at 12 or 13? He's in God's house, in the temple. He's asking questions that they're going, who is this kid? He knows things he should not know. Luke is using this as a reference tool to get us to understand that Jesus, as the Messiah, he began to bring change into the world before he actually began his ministry. John the Baptist began. God started putting things into work. Things were in the work. God was working. But we miss that if we just try to just go from one to one and say, oh yeah, this was prophesied. Well, how was it prophesied? Prophecy is not a one-to-one thing. There is a concept that's being developed and brought with it. Okay? All right. So I know I'm spending a lot of time on that, but I think it just needs to help us. All right, so let's get into the former prophets. Remember, this is the beginning section of what we call the prophets. Now, why is the second section of the Hebrew Bible called the prophets? Why is Joshua in the book of prophets? For them, right? Not in your English book. Right? If you've been here, we've been going through the Hebrew, the Jewish structure of their Bible. Why was the next section after Deuteronomy the book of prophets? What is one of the promises in the book of Deuteronomy about a coming person? There's a prophecy that there would be a prophet like Moses. A prophet like Moses would come. And when that prophet would come, you would know that restoration would begin. And so it starts off with, look at all these prophets who almost fit the bill. Joshua starts off really good, right? He's following God. He takes courage. God gives him all the same things that he tells Moses. He's literally taking on the second Moses. He goes through his own little Red Sea crossing, right? He goes through the waters, right? He parts the water. Remember, they didn't just part waters once at the Red Sea, parted it twice. And Joshua reenacts the entire story of Moses until Joshua chapter 9, where he fails, he loses faith. Not this one. And what happens after that book, after Joshua fails? And then you get the book of Judges, right? And you're going to see it progressively get worse until you get to Samuel, and we'll get to him in a moment. But let's stick with Joshua, okay? So let's look at Joshua chapter 5. I want to show some key concepts here to help you get a better picture of this book. Joshua chapter 5. So they are about to take Jericho. They haven't taken Jericho yet. New generation circumcised. Remember, they go to take Jericho. They can't take it, or they lose faith. They start marching. They have to have Passover. God tells them to consecrate themselves. Look at verse 13 of Joshua 5. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him, with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? So this is one of those moments where we talk about the angel of the Lord, right? He's the commander of the Lord's army, but most likely the angel of the Lord. It's a term we use for all these little moments where someone worships God. Most likely a pre-incarnate form of Jesus, by the way. This is most likely Jesus before he came in the flesh. And Joshua asks a very strange question. Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? And what is the response of the commander of the Lord's army? What is the very first word out of his mouth? This was a either or, right? This is typical Jesus, isn't it? Isn't this typical Jesus? You ask a straightforward question. Jesus, pick option 1 or pick option 2. I pick option 3. And his point is, one of the things that you're going to see is that God is getting away from this idea that Israel is so special that they are, just because they're his chosen ones, that they're the only ones God actually cares about. And those are two different things. Because what was Israel's true purpose into the world? What were they supposed to do? They were supposed to be a light. Right when we get to the story of Rahab, and Rahab is she's the character that solidifies this for us. When they go in to Jericho and they find Rahab, what does Rahab's conversation with Joshua look like? Or the two spies look like? What does she tell them? We've heard. We have heard of all the things that your God has done for your people and against his enemies. Now the rest of my people, they're scared and they want to fight. I'm scared, but I want to join. And so there's this covenant made with Rahab and anybody that she can get into her house, right? Anybody she can stuff into this house, which, by the way, that also is a very significant theme. There are always these holy, protected places that when destruction's going on all around, there's a place where you can be saved if you want to be saved from it. And Peter brings that up about the flood, remember? Talks about Noah's ark. What's happening with the world all around Noah? Everybody's dying, but if you're in the ark, right, you're in a boat, you're going to be saved. If you're in this house, you're going to be saved, right? And these happen all the time, throughout. And ultimately, what's going to happen in the New Testament, if you are in whom? If you are in Jesus, there's coming a day where destruction's happening on all those who do not obey, right, and are not in Christ. But if you are in Christ, you are protected from all the destruction that happens around you. So there's these little, Christ figures throughout all these books, but these are themes that are built upon later, okay? So he says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, worshipped, and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army says to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. Does he ever answer his question? No. He just says, you're on holy ground. What more do you need to know? I'm here, and if I'm in your presence, do you need to be concerned about who's my enemy and who's my friend? You just need to be concerned about, are you with me? Not am I with you, right? And that becomes the theme. Not is God with us, but are we with God? And any nation of any people, if there's people from Nineveh and they bow down to God, can they be saved? If there's Gentile nations, well, what if you're a Jew who's a chosen child of God, but you're not with God? Does that give you protection? Remember, they believe this idea of protection so much that in Samuel, when they go to fight when they go to fight, what do they bring with them? They think it's their good luck, their rabbit foot. They bring the Ark of the Covenant thinking, hey, God's in this box, right? They're taking all these principles that they've learned through these stories. I mean, these stories have taught them stuff. God's in this box. So if God's in this box, we can take this box with us, right? And we can walk out and people will just be obliterated because God's here. Well, you can't contain God's in boxes unless God says, I'm in the box. If God ain't in the building, right, then it don't matter about how special the building is. And that becomes a principle in Habakkuk. Remember when they're rebuilding the temple, and the old generation who saw the former temple, it was huge. In this new temple, in comparison, itty bitty bitty, right? And Habakkuk goes, if God's Spirit's there, it don't matter how big it is or how small it is. If God's there, I mean, that's what you're looking for. And by the way, there's coming a time where there's not going to be a magic box. There's not going to be a place where you go worship. God's a spirit, and everywhere He is, and those who have His Spirit, as Habakkuk says, sound a lot like what Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well. So you see these themes that they're not just good moral stories about, hey, do we have faith or we don't? Are we like David or are we not? There is more to learn. There's more to see. And these themes become developed and taken and molded and made bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's ultimately, Jesus says, that's what the word fulfillment means. Is He takes concepts, right? Think about a glass of water, I've said. He takes concepts that, are here and may fill up, but He fills it to its fullest. Can anybody fulfill holiness more than Jesus can? The idea of a tabernacle or a temple, can anybody be great? Is there any place or person greater than Jesus? And that's ultimately the Hebrews' entire argument for the book of Hebrews. They're wanting to go back to these things that are down in here. And like, wait a minute, you have this. How can you want to go back to that? Right? It would be like rescuing Rahab from Jericho. And remember, when they go to destroy Jericho, her house is like the only house standing. All around her. Walls fall. By the way, her house was built on the wall. How do you think she led the spies down over the wall? Because her house was connected to the wall. But when the walls fell, and it says all the walls fell, everybody in Rahab's house was protected because the house stood. So not all of the walls were demolished. Imagine, right, all this demolition, and there's this one single house, and all these people kind of come out going, right? You think of those apocalyptic movies, right? A nuke goes off, but one house is, but that's Jesus. Okay, so, all right. So Joshua, he's learning his lessons. AI happens. Why do they lose to AI? Why do they get defeated to AI? I mean, they just beat Jericho. Walls, giants. AI in comparison should have been an easy fight. Sit in the camp, right? Just because God is with you, if sin is there, where is God not? God's not there. God's not with you if sin is in the camp. And that gets a theme that is developed and made fuller. Sometimes we take that one story, but it gets developed and actually made more full. But that's kind of the downfall of the book of Joshua. Yes, they go conquer the promised land, but one of the things you realize when they go to conquer the promised land, guess what they don't conquer all of? They don't get all of it. Does anyone know why they don't get all of it? Joshua 23:16. Somebody read that. Joshua 23:16. Loud and proud.
When you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which He commanded you, and you go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from the good land which He has given you.
So, if you transgress and you go pick up on other gods, what's going to happen to this good land that God has given you? He's going to start taking it back. Guess what the book of Judges is about? The book of Judges is all about, by the way, the book of Judges is not the entire nation. It's individual tribes and individual places that have miniature rebellions. Because they're not one united people yet. That's one thing you're realizing. One of the things you're going to read in Joshua and Judges is everybody went back, it says they went back to their own tribe or they went back to their own family. And there's this idea of my family, right? My family. And so much so that the entire tribe of Benjamin almost gets destroyed because of the my tribe, my family. They have to basically reignite the entire tribe of Benjamin, but that's God, blessing them. But look at and then somebody read our famous Joshua 24:14. It's usually on t-shirts and on walls and all those kinds of things.
Fear the Lord and serve him with all patience. Throw away the gods which forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord.
All right, verse 15 too, sorry.
But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve.
So what did Joshua learn from the commander of the army that he's now giving that advice to all of the nation? Who is God for? God is for anybody who's for him. It doesn't matter if you think you're in a special holy box because I'm an Israelite. If you're an Israelite, but you're a filthy mongrel of a person, God doesn't give you special protection, right? And that's what they're learning. Just because you're an Israelite, and by the way, if you're doing our daily Bible reading, we're about to get to Romans 9, they're going to use this concept of not all Israel is of Israel. And there is a difference between spiritual circumcised Israel, who had their heart circumcised, like back in Deuteronomy, versus people who are just, hey, I've got the blood of Abraham running through my veins. That's not the same. It started off with that concept, so God can grow them, but as they grew and as they learned and as they matured, they were supposed to mature as a nation and learn. God tolerated it less and less and less and less, to the point where he sends them into bigger exiles and bigger exiles and bigger exiles all the way into the Babylonian exile, which is exactly all of the same verbiage that Jesus uses in Matthew 24 to talk to the Jews about the destruction of Jerusalem is their sign of signs that I am done with Israel. Physical Israel. If you want to be a part of spiritual Israel, it's about being in Jesus. It's no longer bloodlines. It's about the blood of Jesus. Okay? So Joshua ends. Joshua sees it. He's seeing it like Moses saw it. And one of the themes that you see throughout, you're especially going to see this in Kings, is if the king was good, what was the nation? They're pretty decent. If the king was evil, what was the nation? They were evil. Joshua is already seeing this, and he's trying to get individuals. You and your family, please make the decision. Me and my family, we're going to go serve the Lord. Please make that decision. Don't go follow after the gods. Don't invite the Canaanites in. Well, Book of Judges comes along. And what are individual families doing? They're bringing in false idols. So much so that there's even a judge, Jephthah, who has an idol in his house, and he makes a false promise to this idol that the next thing that I see, I'm going to sacrifice to this idol. What's the next thing that he sees? His daughter. Now, we're not going to get into the debate whether he actually sacrificed his daughter or not. That's another debate. But those are the kind of oaths that were being made. People who do not know God. Okay, so you got this key concept running through, and this is where inheritance of Benjamin saved. God sends them judges to save them. Those are kind of the people who are saving them. God's the one saving. God's the one sending. Then, at the very last verse of Judges, someone read the very last verse of Judges. Judges is one we spend a lot of time on. It's very circular. It's very cyclical, not circular. It's they do good, God brings them out of captivity. They do bad, God sends them a judge to save them. Rinse and repeat, okay? all the way to the very end of the book of Judges, what is the very last verse?
In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Do you remember when I made the comment that there's little notes at the end of books that tell you that this person's writing later? First of all, in the book of Judges, Israel doesn't have a king. They haven't asked for a king yet. Nobody here would have expected a king. So the person who's writing this at the end is letting people know who's reading it many years later, well, wait a minute, where's their king who should have been helping them? At this time in Israel's history, he's looking way back. There were no kings in Israel. And every man did what was right in his own eyes. What's the very next book in the Hebrew Bible? Not in your Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible. Samuel. And what is Samuel all about? How do we get a king? Do you see how there is a development of themes? At the end of every book is leading you into the next one. They're not disjointed, they're not disconnected, they're not meant to be studied by themselves. They're meant to be built on one another. But the way our Bibles have reordered them sometimes, we miss it and we don't read the next verse, which is just the next book or the next scroll, because this theme is going to be now later developed into the next one. Because one of the things that you see in the book of Judges is all the tribes it's my tribe, my family. I don't care about other tribes. I don't care about other families. Well, God's going to kind of condense that. Okay, let's all rally under one banner here. Let's all rally under one banner. Now, they want to jump the gun, and what kind of king do they want? They want a king like the nations. Well, if you've been reading the book of Judges, why do they want a king like the nations? Because that's been their history. The thing that kept causing them to fail and fail and fail and fail again is inviting Canaanites and the Philistines into their life and bringing their worship into their life. No wonder they want to be like them. They already are like them. That's the point. Israel's already like them. And what's the very first story in the book of Samuel? What's the very first story in 1 Samuel chapter 1? Huh? Hannah? Who's Hannah? It's Hannah, right? Okay. Who's Hannah? She is the mother of Samuel. What can she not have? Has barrenness ever come up in the story of Scripture before? Do you know what barrenness is a sign of in Scripture? God not being there. Because God promised, I will make your womb alive. I will make your descendants many. I will make you fruitful. So when you see a story of a woman who can't bear children, you're watching God not being a part of the picture. That's why when she goes to the temple, who is the only one who can activate her womb? I'm just going to use that. Who's the only one? If she wants a child, who's the only one who can give it to her? God. Because God is the one who's promised that the seed would continue. Interestingly enough, with Samuel, when Samuel is being trained by Eli, do you know what it said about when Samuel's fully trained? What God had not done since the time of Joshua? He had not spoken to them. Read with me in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 19. Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him. Let none of his words fall to the ground. And all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Okay, now where I'm talking about? One second. Oh, man, that's what happens when you're studying these things. 18 books at one time. Well, just trust me, it's in there. I will bring it up next week. But there is a section that it says he did not speak to Eli. His sons never heard the word of the Lord. Eli and his sons never heard the word of the Lord until Eli is punished by God later, right? Where God comes and says, hey, why have you not? And then he curses them. But here's the point. There's barrenness. God's Spirit has not been with them. Now it's in Samuel. He's the prophet, right? Well, they don't want to follow a prophet who would give them direct communication to God. They want a king. And so Saul becomes... Is that second bell? All right.